Okay, so we're continuing 1.1. Today's lesson is over scientific notation. So if you've seen and you really understand scientific notation, you probably could skip this. But if your scientific notation is something that either you've been a while since you've seen it or you don't really remember it, so that's what today's lesson is over, scientific notation. Which again, if you've been in any type of science class, you've seen this before, hopefully. All right, scientific notation is just shorthand for a really, really big number. And the really big number could either be a really big number like something in the millions or the thousands, or it could be a really big decimal, right? It's a decimal, which technically a decimal is a really small number, but the number itself is large. There's a lot of parts to it. All right, so it's a large decimal, which we can write with scientific notation. Right, how we do that is, well, we write it in this form. Right? So the first thing is this C. Well, this C value is I want to get down to a number that's between 1 and 10. Right? So I usually move to the end of my either really big number or my really big decimal till I get a number between 1 and 10. Alright, then it's times 10, and what this 10 represents is we're in base 10, right? When you have a number, you have the ones place, the tens place, the hundreds place, the thousands place, and the same thing in the decimal direction, right? It's the tenths place, the hundredths place, the thousandths place, and so we're moving by tens, right? So when we move the decimal, we move by tens, and so that's what that 10 represents. It represents that movement of my decimal. How many times I move the decimal, well, that's what the n is, alright? N is always an integer. And it's a positive integer if my number is a very large number. Alright, so I'm moving my decimal to the left to go from a really large number to a smaller number that I need to multiply by 10 raised to a positive. If it's the decimal case, I do the opposite. It's a negative number. And think about it, negative numbers means fraction, right? That's what decimal is, a fraction. And so it's always a negative number if I'm moving my decimal in a, like I said, a small decimal. So I'm moving it to the right. I can't get the number out. And it's easy to see an example. I'll go through it in an example. Alright, so an example, we'll start with the big positive number. Alright, suppose my big positive number is 93 million, right? It's a big number. And so what they do in math and science, especially, they do this a lot in science, is instead of writing out that really, really big number every time, they shorten it to scientific notation. And so what we want to get, well, first thing I have to do is I have to figure out what C is. And so C has got to be a number between 1 and 10. And so what you do is you sort of look at the end of this. So you go to the end, and this 9.3, or this 93 right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it 9.3. That's going to be my C value. That's that first part of the scientific notation. Well, how do I get the decimal point here in 9.3? Well, it was here. Right, it was at the beginning of my big number, and I had to move it. Well, that movement, how many places I moved the decimal, well, that's the n value. Right, that's this n exponent value. And so I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so I had to move the decimal place 7 places. And it's 7 by tens, right? This would be the first, this would be the 10th place, 100th place, thousandths, 10,000ths, and so on. So I move it all the way out here. And so I am moving by 10. And so when we write this in scientific notation, this number in scientific notation is equal to 9.3 times 10 to the 7th power. And if you actually multiply that out in your calculator as it's written, it will give you this number, the original number I had there. Alright, well, if I erase all the red stuff that I've put in here. If you multiply, if you got out your calculator, you take 9.3 times 10 to the 7th, it will give you that number out. Alright, it'll give you that number. And again, this is just the scientific notation. It's the shorthand for it. Decimals work the same way. So suppose I have a decimal, so it's a really big decimal, which means it's a really small number. Alright, but something like this. Alright, that's a big decimal. Alright, which means it's actually a really, really small number, but it's a big decimal, right? There's a lot of parts to it. And so what we do is, well, we do the same thing. The first thing I do is I find C. Well, I go to the end of my number, which in this case, the end of the number is over here, and I want to get down to the 5.2, right? 5.2 is between 1 and 10. I want to move my decimal to get down, so there's the C part. And so, well, how do I get to the C part? Well, I have to move my decimal down. Well, how many? And again, I'm moving in this direction. And so when I move in this direction, it's going to come out a negative number. And whenever it's a decimal, rule of thumb just remembers it's going to be negative. And you can always check your answer. So when we multiply this, or we get the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so, make sure I counted right. That's n, but it's moving in the negative direction, so that would be a negative 5. Right? Negative 5 is what the n value is. And so we write this out in scientific notation. It would be the 5.2 times 10, but it's to the negative 5. Another way to remember it's a negative 5, remember negative exponents means reciprocal, which means this number really is a fraction. It really is a decimal, right? That's what a fraction is. A fraction can be written as a fraction or decimal. And so remember, whenever it's a fraction or a decimal, the exponent is negative 5. Or is negative. In this case, it's negative 5. Right? And that's the scientific notation. Working in the other direction, which, like I said, you could actually just multiply this out. If you actually multiply this out, some calculators will give it to you, some of them will give it to you in scientific notation. We'll talk about what the calculator gives it to you in a little bit. Alright, but now working in the other direction, suppose I started with a number. Alright, 1.2 times 10 to the 5th, which again, you could probably multiply that on the calculator and it would give you the answer. But what it is, I start out with 1, 2, and then remember, I'm going to move this decimal place, which was here. Right, it was here. I'm going to write it in red because I'm moving it. I'm going to move it 5 spots. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 puts the decimal place here, which means I need placeholders, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? And so the actual number is 2 with 4 zeros. An easy way to remember it, 2 counts as 1. So that would be 1 of the 5 places I need to move it. So I need 4 decimals after that to get to the 5 spots, right? And so the number is actually 120,000. I'll do a decimal version of it too. Alright, 6.3 times 10 to the negative 8. So again, remember it's the decimal, so I'm actually going to write my number way over here. Alright, so 6... Alright, so 6, remember the decimal was here between the 6 and the 3, and I want to move it 8 times. Well, if you want to think about it, and I'm moving it in the negative direction, means it's going to be a decimal, so I'm moving it this way. And so what you have to remember, well, one move is to get me past the 6, and that's 1, which means I've got 7 more moves to go, which means I need 7 zeros, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then to check that my decimal's in the right spot, well, there's 1 move, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Puts me in the right place. And so my number is point, in the decimal point, 7 zeros, 6, 3, which again is a really big decimal. Alright, and that's the scientific notation. Alright, now what the calculator gives you. So we're going to do a couple examples on the calculator, because the calculator gives you slightly different notation if you're using a TI-83, 84, Inspire, or something along those lines. Alright, so I'm going to type some numbers in the calculator. I'm going to type 1 divided by 100,000. Oops, I did a million. And see what the calculator spits out at me. So I'm going to go to my calculator. So my calculator here. So here's my TI-84. And so I'm going to type in 1 divided by my 100,000. Alright, and then what the calculator gives me is that 1e to the negative 4. And what that 1e to the negative 4 is, and make sure I didn't miss a 0. I did 10,000 instead of. Let me try it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Enter there. 1e to the negative 5 is what the calculator, and that's the calculator's version of scientific notation. So if I go back to here, the calculator gives me 1e to the negative 5. And what that means, this e means times 10 to the negative 5. And so the e stands in place of the times 10. Right, which means that's the decimal 1. That's the decimal 1 goes over here. And then I move my decimal place 5 spots. That means 1. And then I need 4 zeros in front of it. And to check, my decimal place was here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's in the right spot. And so that's what the calculator, well, what if I do a really big number on the calculator? So I'm going to take 20 raised to the 7th power. Actually, that might be a little too big. I might do 20 raised to the 6th power. Oops. Calculator, alright, so clear that out. I'm going to clear. My calculator's being a little slow, because programs are. Alright, there we go. 20 raised to the 6, I think is what I said. So it didn't give me scientific notation. Alright, so I might go a little higher. I'll go 20 raised to the 8. There we go. Now I got scientific. So the first one, actually, the calculator didn't give me scientific notation. I wanted to make sure I got one with scientific notation. So I switched it to 20 raised to the 8. And there's the scientific notation that they gave me, 2.56 e to the 10. So switch back to my notes. So I changed this to 8, which on the calculator came out 2.56 e to the 10, which remember that e is just the calculator's version of scientific notation. So 2.56 times 10, and then the 10 represents the n. Right, so this is a really big number. So I've got to move my decimal place 10 times. So first it's 2. I move it twice to get past the 5 and 6. So 1, 2, which means I still need 8 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Make sure that I've moved it right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there's my ridiculously big number. Right? And so that would be an example of scientific notation on the calculator. So make sure you're careful when you're typing these out on the calculator. Alright, so make sure you practice and understand what the notation means. And I'm going to show you again how you type it in. Suppose you have, alright, so suppose you want to solve something like this. You've got 3 times 10 to the 5th. That's what the problem gives you. And you want to divide that by 50. Alright, so how do I do that on the calculator? Alright, so I'm going to go to my calculator. And so how you put the scientific notation in the calculator is you're going to do 3. And then if you look here, this EE stands for that E term. Right, that's that E term. And so I have to hit second, the comma, and then that'll put an E in there. Right, so that E stands for times 10. And then I have to write my exponent, and so it was 10 to the 5th. So there's that 3 times 10 to the 5th, and then I hit divide by 50. And then the calculator says, well, that's 6,000. Alright, and so that's how, again, on the calculator, you've got to type in 3e to the 5th, divide by 50. How you plug it into the calculator, and that comes out the 6,000. Alright, so just make sure you're careful. Kind of practice it a little bit, plugging in and dealing with the calculator. Alright, we'll stop there.